September 1944. A regimental operations tent sits near the rain-slicked banks of the Moselle River in France. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of wet canvas, stale coffee, and the ink of military maps. A high-ranking officer leans over a wooden table, tracing a route through a deep ravine with a silver-tipped pencil. He ignores the stack of grainy, black and white, aerial photographs sitting just inches from his hand. Outside the tent, 31 men are checking their gear, preparing for an assault through that very ravine. They do not know that the ground they are about to walk on has been reshaped by years of industrial grading and German engineering. They do not know they are walking into a trap because of a map printed 26 years ago. General Patton will soon discover that while the terrain changes, some men are too stubborn to change with it. His response will ensure that no officer ever mistakes an antique for reality again. This is the story of how an officer's obsession with the past led to a modern slaughter, and how General Patton forced him to face the blood on his hands. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Your support helps us bring these forgotten pieces of history back to life. Corporal Vincent Moretti was 22 years old and hailed from a cramped, noisy apartment in Brooklyn, New York. He served with the Regimental Intelligence Section, specifically as an aerial reconnaissance photo interpreter. Before the war, Vincent had spent his nights studying drafting at a technical school, hoping to build the skyscrapers that defined the skyline of his home borough. He was a man of precision and fine lines. He had seen the cost of bad information firsthand during the hedgerow fighting in Normandy, where a misplaced mortar coordinate had cost him his best friend. Since then, he had become obsessive about his work. He would spend hours squinting through a stereoscope at grainy black and white images, looking for the telltale shadows of a newly dug trench or the unnatural geometry of a minefield. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot from the strain, but he refused to sleep until he was certain of the ground his fellow soldiers were about to tread. 3 days ago, he had filed a formal report stating that the ravine on the maps was no longer there. Major Conrad Hartley was 48 years old and came from an old, wealthy family in Boston, Massachusetts. He was an operations officer who had been recalled from a comfortable teaching post at the Army War College. Hartley viewed war as a gentleman's chess match, governed by the timeless principles of the Great War he had studied for 2 decades. To him, the French military cartography of 1918 was the absolute gold standard of human achievement. He believed that the earth was static and that the maps of his youth were infallible documents of truth. He carried a leather map case, monogrammed with his initials in gold leaf, which contained nothing but pre-war maps he had collected like rare art. He openly mocked the work of men like Moretti, calling the modern aerial photographs nothing more than blurry guesswork for those who lacked the intellect to read a proper topographic survey. He firmly believed that if a 1918 map said a ravine existed, then the ravine existed, regardless of what a camera lens suggested. This rigid adherence to the past was about to collide with a very modern disaster. By September 1944, the Allied dash across France had slowed to a grueling crawl. The heady days of the summer breakout from Normandy were over. The Third Army had reached the Moselle River, a natural barrier backed by the formidable fortifications of Metz. Logistics had become a nightmare. Gasoline was scarce, and the rapid pace of the advance meant that frontline units were often operating on the fringes of their supply lines and intelligence networks. The German army, though retreating, was far from defeated. They were moving into prepared positions, utilizing the rugged terrain of the Lorraine region to bleed the American advance dry. In this environment, the accuracy of a map was not just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival. The chaos of the occupation and the shifting front lines meant that the landscape was literally being reshaped by the minute. German engineers were masters of demolition and fortification. They filled ravines to deny cover, flooded valleys to create impassable bogs, and sowed thousands of mines in the very places an advancing army would most likely seek refuge. Many senior officers, however, struggled to accept how quickly the world was changing. They had been trained in a different era where the terrain was a permanent fixture and military geography was a static science. In the upper echelons of the staff tents, a dangerous gap was widening between the men who looked at the dirt and the men who looked at the paper. Commanders in other sectors had already begun to notice that pre-war maps were increasingly unreliable, but few were willing to challenge the established hierarchy of the War College. Reports of terrain discrepancies were often filed away as minor errors or soldierly exaggerations. It was a failure of imagination as much as a failure of intelligence. The military bureaucracy was designed to trust the printed word of a government survey over the frantic scribbles of a corporal in the field. This systemic arrogance had already cost lives in the hedgerows, but it was about to reach breaking point in the muddy hills near the Moselle. The stage was set for a disaster that would eventually bring the full, cold weight of George Patton's justice down upon a single tent. Captain Silas Miller walked into the regimental operations tent with a heavy folder tucked under his arm. He found Major Hartley seated at the center table, polishing the brass hardware on his leather map case with a silk handkerchief. Miller cleared his throat and laid a set of high-altitude reconnaissance photos over the 1918 map. He pointed to a specific grid coordinate where the dark shadows of the ravine should have been. But instead, the image showed a flat, textured expanse of gray. The major did not look up immediately. He continued to buff the leather until it shone. He finally glanced at the photos with an expression of profound boredom. He asked what this was. Miller explained that these were the latest prints from the morning flyover. He told the major that the ravine the assault force was supposed to use for cover was gone. He said the Germans had filled it with slag and earth, and that the photo interpreters were certain the area was now a massive, hidden minefield. Hartley sighed and pushed the photos aside with the tip of his finger. He said he had already reviewed the terrain. He tapped his 1918 map and told Miller that this document had been produced by the finest cartographers in the French army. He said the geography of Europe does not change because of a few years of unpleasantness. Miller hesitated but pressed forward. He reminded the major that Corporal Moretti had flagged this discrepancy 3 days ago, and that the scout reports were now confirming the photo interpretation. The major stood up and straightened his tunic. He looked at Miller as if he were explaining a simple concept to a slow child. He told the captain that he had spent 10 years at the War College teaching the geometry of the Moselle. He said he would not have his operational planning disrupted by a Brooklyn technician with a magnifying glass. He called the aerial photos blurry guesswork that lacked the dignity of a proper survey. He said the attack would go forward exactly as ordered because the map was the only reality he recognized. Miller told him that 31 men were about to walk into a killing ground. He asked the major if he was willing to bet those lives on a piece of paper printed when the Kaiser was still in power. Hartley's face flushed a deep red. He told Miller that rank had its privileges, and one of those privileges was the authority to decide which facts were relevant. He said the conversation was over and ordered the captain to leave the tent. Miller did not go to his quarters. He went straight to the signal corps and demanded a priority line. The report reached Patton within the hour. The low rumble of a multi-bank engine preceded the arrival of the open-top Jeep. It came to a sharp halt directly in front of the operations tent, kicking up a spray of French mud. Patton stepped out before the vehicle had even finished settling on its springs. He was a vision of silver and starch, his helmet liner polished to a mirror shine and the 4 stars on his shoulders catching the dim afternoon light. On his hips sat the ivory-handled revolvers that had become a legend in their own right. He did not say a word as he entered the tent, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The officers inside snapped to attention, their breath hitching in their chests. Patton did not look at them. He walked straight to the center table, where the maps were spread out like a shroud. Patton leaned over the table, his eyes darting between the 1918 map and the modern aerial photographs. He asked Major Hartley which of these documents he had used to plan the assault on the ravine. Hartley stood stiffly, his chin tucked, and pointed to the yellowed French map. He told the general that this was the definitive topographic survey of the sector. Patton asked him when that map had been printed. Hartley replied that it was the 1918 edition. Patton stood up straight, his hands resting on his belt. He asked the major what year it was currently. Hartley swallowed hard and said it was 1944. Patton then picked up the written report from Corporal Moretti and held it in front of the major's face. He asked Hartley if he had read the warning about the filled ravine 3 days ago. Hartley admitted that he had, but stated he found the source unreliable compared to the established record. "You seem to believe that the world is a museum, Major, but I am in the business of geography in motion. You sat in a classroom for 20 years teaching men how to fight over a landscape that no longer exists. You held onto a piece of paper like it was holy scripture, while the enemy was outside with shovels and mines, rewriting the very earth beneath your feet. You ignored the eyes of a corporal who saw the truth, because he didn't have the right pedigree or a leather case to hold his findings. Look at these photos. That isn't blurry guesswork, that is the graveyard you built for 31 of my soldiers. You chose an antique over an observation. You chose your own ego over the lives of men who trusted you to know where they were walking. A map is a tool, not a monument, and when a tool is broken, you discard it. Instead, you discarded the lives of your infantry. You have a choice. You can admit here and now that you are unfit to lead a section in this man's army, or you can go and see the geography you've been defending. You will personally walk every meter of that ravine with a mine detector in your hand. You will work alongside the engineers who are currently pulling the broken bodies of your men out of that dirt. You will see what 1944 looks like up close." Major Hartley stood paralyzed, his face a mask of pale shock. He looked at the ivory revolvers, then at the cold, unblinking eyes of his commander. He realized there was no academic retreat left for him. He reached out and slowly picked up the heavy mine detector, leaning against the tent pole. He did not say a word as he turned and walked out into the rain. The punishment began at dawn. Major Hartley was marched out to the edge of the sector, his polished boots sinking deep into the cold, cliched mud of the Moselle Valley. He carried the heavy mine detector like a cross, the headphones pressed against his ears, as he listened to the low, humming whine of the electronics. He was flanked by a squad of combat engineers who did not speak to him. They simply watched with hollow eyes as the man who had ordered 31 soldiers into a grave was forced to find the ones he had missed. The air was thick with the metallic scent of upturned earth and the heavy, sweet rot of the battlefield. Every time the detector wailed, Hartley's entire body seized. He had to drop to his knees in the filth, using a bayonet to probe the soil for the jagged wooden edges of the shoe-minches he had claimed did not exist. Behind him, he could see the recovery teams lifting stretchers wrapped in olive-drab blankets. The men in the regiment stood on the ridge, silent and unmoving, watching the Boston aristocrat crawl through the muck of 1944. There were no maps to save him now, only the rhythmic sweep of the sensor and the terrifying reality of the ground. Corporal Vincent Moretti survived the war and returned to Brooklyn in late 1945. He never became the architect he had dreamed of being before the Moselle. Instead, he spent 40 years working for the city's Department of Urban Planning, obsessively updating geological surveys and transit maps. He was known as a man who would never approve a project until he had walked the site himself, regardless of what the blueprints said. He died in 1991, leaving behind a massive collection of aerial photography journals. Major Conrad Hartley was quietly relieved of his command and reassigned to a logistics depot in England 2 weeks after the incident. He was forced into early retirement in 1946. He returned to Boston and lived a secluded life in a house filled with antique maps and military history books. He never wrote his planned memoir of the war. Neighbors said he was often seen in his garden, staring at the ground for hours as if waiting for a sound that never came. He passed away in 1968, still insisting to his few visitors that the modern world was a messy, imprecise place. Patton rarely mentioned the incident in his official correspondence, but he kept Moretti's original, ignored reconnaissance report in his personal files until the day he died. In a private letter to his wife, Beatrice, he wrote that the most dangerous weapon in any army is a high-ranking officer who has stopped learning. He believed that blood was the price of a closed mind. Some historians argue that Patton's punishment of Major Hartley was unnecessarily cruel and served more as a public humiliation than a tactical lesson. They suggest that the failure was systemic, a byproduct of an army struggling to integrate rapid technological shifts like aerial reconnaissance into a traditional command structure. Others argue that Patton's decisive action was the only way to break the dangerous inertia of the officer corps. They contend that by making the consequences of arrogance visible and physical, he saved countless lives in future operations. What is certain is that after this incident, the Third Army became the most effective force in Europe at utilizing real-time intelligence to navigate the changing face of modern war. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand and reassigned the officer? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.